Okay. So I'm going to talk about this case study for Module 2. There we go. And the crux of this particular one was balancing inclusivity with free speech. So the case itself was walling off, I think it was walling off. So many tabs. Here we go, walling off or welcoming in. And the challenge was, especially following the 2016 election, the increase in hateful rhetoric or speech, both in the public square and within schools, that was causing conflict, and the challenge of educators to seemingly be politically unbiased or impartial, or even so far as neutral, while also fulfilling their duties as an educator and creating a safe environment for students to learn. And so this particular document is giving like a transcript of a discussion of this particular case, and references some students being ostracized because the family supports Trump. And so in this case, some of the people who are speaking on that side of the political coin. And I think a really good section or example of this is, said there are kids in his class who wouldn't work with them just because they know our family voted for Trump. He wants to switch schools but can't afford to move to a wider district or send him to private school. I do think it's telling that they think moving to a wider district would solve this problem, that they would politically, specifically in voting for president or not experiencing comments that made them feel excluded, that they would not feel as excluded if they were in a wider district, because that's conflating race with political ideology, which many would claim Trump was doing, and Trump supporters would claim that he is not. So I think that right there is a tell. Or send him to private school. And discussing how to handle Trump statements. The other very telling or relevant passage that I found was, where is it? Right here. That there was a poster that was in a classroom, and this supposed parent says, "I'm all for teaching kindness. Just don't confuse kindness for political ideology. Democrats don't have a monopoly on good character, but I understand why you might think otherwise given the liberal bias of teachers in the school." Again, very accusatory. Your friend Susie over there has liberal propaganda all over her whiteboard, and Colin, the student, tells me about it daily, and they're like, oh, the poster, like they didn't even really understand what they were referring to. And it specifically mentions minority or underprivileged groups, and says that your life matters, you're loved. And because it does not specifically mention white people or boys, Colin noticed he's the only one that left out, and he feels that's unfair, and the parent clearly thinks that this is unfair as well. It's meant to counter the verbal attacks on specific populations of people by Donald Trump and some of his supporters, while emphasizing our classroom and values of inclusion. They're trying to find a way to resolve these tensions to ensure a safe environment where everyone is loved and cared for. And we also need to stay politically neutral, or at least cultivate respect for different perspectives. And I think that last part is key. Call out bullying when we see it. How can we do all that at once? How can we ensure everyone feels safe, no one is singled out, and honor contradictory perspectives, some of which further serve to marginalize people or intentionally leave them out. So how can we be inclusive when the ideologies we're including are exclusive? And normalizing perspectives that fundamentally attack other people's identities or beliefs. And then it kind of ends with, so this is all great, but like, what's our policy? So to start out with, I think it's important to look at this from two lenses, specifically student right to free speech law and any precedent in terms of free speech. Just make sure I'm recording still. But then also what the legal, moral, and ethical responsibilities of the educator are, because we also have a responsibility to do our job. And if there are elements preventing us from doing our job or things that are in direct conflict of us fulfilling our duty as educators, I think that is also good grounds for policy within a school. And so if we look at things I'd like to look at are the case law precedent, specifically Tinker versus Des Moines, and freedom of expression, which is not necessarily freedom from consequences of that expression. Should the goal be to remain entirely politically neutral in a classroom? Is it possible to do so? What I think best practices or suggested steps would be for educators, and some anecdotal evidence from my own personal teaching experience over the last 8 years, albeit in very highly conservative, Republican, religious environments where a lot of this is sounding familiar. So, looking at an educator's duty, so student free speech rights, they have the freedom to express themselves as long as there's no constitutionally protected rationale to limit their speech, meaning threats of bodily harm to a specific individual or things that would rise to be covered under another clause, or, and this is key, so far as they do not materially disrupt the functioning of the schools. The school still needs to be legally and logistically able to fulfill its functions, which is why I think this connects to looking at educator responsibilities, because if behavior or speech is preventing educators from being able to, in full conscience, do their job, their responsibility as educators, then it is in fact materially disrupting the functioning of the school that those educators serve. And the other implication of this as well is that they are right to freely express their views, but there can be consequences of expressing viewpoints, and the freedom of speech does not protect people from all consequences of that speech. Now, again, that can tie back to creating a non-hostile educational environment where students, educators in the school can fulfill their functions within that organization, but it's important to make the distinction between the freedom to say things and the freedom to have no consequences for saying things. If we look at educator responsibilities, it's our duty to provide a safe and effective education for all children, specifically pulling from a document describing the federal civil rights laws and Supreme Court precedents that require states to provide equal access to public education for all children, including undocumented children, including any sort of distinguish between race, sex, gender, ethnic background, socioeconomic background, and per the Kansas Educator Code of Conduct, these are ones I pulled out that I thought were particularly relevant in this discussion, which is creating, supporting, and maintaining a challenging learning environment for all students. And part of a challenging learning environment for all students is training them to think critically and to have good reasons for their arguments and why they say what they say, and to push them to become a better person who can interact with people from different perspectives. I know from my point of view, my standards as a world language teacher literally include in the 5 C's, connections, comparisons, cultures, and this literally dictates I need to be exposing students to a wide variety of points of view and comparing and contrasting different cultural perspectives, linguistic characteristics, and so it is quite literally my duty to educate students about other people, other ways of life, other backgrounds, different, to educate them on different, as part of learning a different language. Advocating for fair and equitable opportunities for all children, so being fair and equitable across how we teach kids, nurturing the intellectual, physical, emotional, social, and civic potential of all students. That one's huge. Embodying for students the characteristics of honesty, diplomacy, tact, and fairness, which I think comes into play later when I talk about should teachers disclose their political opinions. Fulfilling the roles of mentor and advocate for students in a professional relationship, meaning expressing concern, empathy, and encouragement for students, and providing professional education services in a non-discriminatory manner, meaning the education we're providing is not discriminating or being discriminatory in any way. Okay, so freedom of expression, not freedom from consequences. This is where I think we're conflating a lot of things. So an emotional reaction to someone expressing their views, or someone just expressing disagreement or feeling isolated because they expressed their views, I don't view that as the definition of discriminatory. I think that if it affected, if it was just constant, repeated, there could be a world in which, if every kid on the playground is ignoring them for months on it, like weeks on end, like that's not cool. And we might need to address that and talk about it. But I've also seen a lot of it, especially in the context of the 2016 election, where it's things like, oh, well, no one wants to talk to me now because I said people from Mexico are mostly criminals. And there are literally so many people in the class that either are Mexican heritage or have friends that are, or are highly empathetic and don't understand why you could write off a country that way. And I think that's just evidence that we need to be stepping into this stuff even more than we are. Because that's a factual statement. Like, you can easily refute that. I think most people from Mexico are mostly criminals. Like, you could address that. That's a claim. Why can't I get a date? It's probably because I'm not a feminist and it's not fair. So, like, high schoolers complaining about why don't women want to date me, but then everything that comes out of their mouth is misogynistic and demeaning toward women. I feel people stare at me when I wear my insert logo or slogan or political phrase, shirt, hat. It makes me uncomfortable. Well, you are in some ways instigating that treatment because you are wearing that thing. So on the one hand, while some of these can rise to discriminatory and problematic behavior, I think it's important to look in context and look at how long is this going on. My experience is that a lot of the more conservative complaints tend to be a little bit more isolated in time, whereas the ongoing oppression or discrimination against historically marginalized groups, they've been dealing with it forever and are only now just getting some level of protection and feeling like they have a voice and that they can speak. And it is those who have been the cultural majority for so long that are now only starting to feel a portion of what others have felt for a long time. And it feels unfair because it's taking a privilege that they did not have, or that they had, but that was an unfair level of privilege. But it feels like stealing because they're not used to not having that privilege. Now, should the goal be to remain entirely neutral? So, like in this case, like, how do these teachers address the things that are being said? And he mentions, like, remaining entirely politically neutral. And I would argue that we should consider that claim. Should teachers remain entirely neutral? In one resource from Southern Poverty Law Center, a high school teacher said, for the first time in my career, I state bluntly what is appropriate conduct for a candidate for this country's highest office. If it can get you suspended from high school, you shouldn't be espousing it as a candidate. And I think that is, my students need to know that some of what they're witnessing is not okay. And I think that is on the money, that if we have already set up social, cultural standards for behavior and how we treat one another, that are already in place at a school prior to when it was political. It was not usually political for us to demand that presidents didn't demean whole groups of people from the podium. But now that's more of a thing than it used to be. And I mean, there were isolated incidences and obviously historical, cultural insensitivities, but not to the scale and to the intent of normalizing it. And so, um, if it wasn't okay prior to the election, then just because the election happened and somebody on a very widely viewed platform normalized it, quote, that doesn't change whether or not it's okay or not. The school policy existed for a reason, or what we expected of student behavior was one thing and it hasn't changed. The only reason it's changed is because they're following the model of adults in the real world saying that, oh, it's okay to act this way now. Look at the Charlottesville protesters and the comment that Trump made about the neo-Nazis that were protesting, and there was a car that ran into people, and his comment was there were good people on both sides. And in saying that, he equated people protesting or like trying to raise the voices of those in minority groups to neo-Nazis, and self-advocated white supremacists saying that white people are inherently better and worth more than people of color, and people of color should move over. They were carrying torches, clearly leaning on imagery from the Civil War, which would lend a person to think of how far would they go in order to see that world appear. Certainly not, you know, we believe that all men are created equal and they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So he equated these two things, and that's the question: is if neutrality means saying neo-Nazis who say that everyone who isn't white is less than me and shouldn't have certain rights and yada yada yada, that we're literally currently giving them in public education and things like that, they're the same as these other people who are just saying, can we not kill people without reason to kill people? That's a false equivalent. Like, if we start saying that's equal, what else do we say is equal? It verges on doublespeak, 1984 style. And this is what kids are seeing without necessarily having all of the faculties and developmental ability to process them. Feigned neutrality supports the status quo and can often be more damaging than explicit and clear communication. So what unspoken messages are being given because a teacher is attempting to remain neutral? Does that in effect mean that it is not neutral? And I would make the argument there is no neutral, that teaching has always been political. And neutrality or critical thinking with space for all to speak, maybe neutrality shouldn't be the goal then. Maybe the goal should be critical thinking, teaching students how to think, not what to think. And then if they happen to arrive at certain conclusions and have good arguments and good reason for why they did, well, then that is the goal. To teach them how to speak to one another, express viewpoints, and have good arguments while maintaining respect and space for the individuals in the room. So separating ideas and arguments from people. But we argue ideas, not people. And, all it takes for evil to prosper is for good men to do nothing. So how far are we willing to go down the slippery slope of eerily fascism and Nazi Germany before we speak up and say, no, now is not the time to be neutral? I think also there's a difference between being political and being partisan. And I do agree, I don't think schools should be partisan or teachers should be partisan. But I don't think teachers should be apolitical. Because we're preparing students for the real world where they will be challenged on what they believe. And they will have real consequences for their views. And people will treat them in ways that we can't control, so ways that are terrible. And how they discuss these views will actually affect their success in the future. The other thing is it even possible to remain neutral? They did a study on social studies teachers, and so many were doing just a ton of work and energy to try to remain neutral, and yet other research has found that whether or not they actually try or mean to disclose their beliefs, they're constantly sending political messages in the classroom. So if even at our best efforts, we're actually not being neutral, at what point are we fighting a losing battle by being expected to not be? Like, wouldn't clarity actually be more kind? Actually, sometimes it's the unspoken things that allow students to assume or to impose their own assumptions and predispositions to what a teacher has said or not said or done that might create meaning that isn't there. Whereas if we actually talk about the elephant in the room, maybe we could arrive at a piece of common ground. So I would say a couple things. The non-negotiables are educators have a duty to educate all students, and that involves creating an environment where they feel respected and safe to think and learn and be exposed to new ideas. And there is significant evidence showing that hostile environments, especially with things that are or border on hate speech, do affect student learning, which inhibits the educator's ability to do their job, which means that it impedes the school to do their job. And so, at a certain point, creating a safe, non-hostile environment and demanding respect of every person as a non-negotiable is within the educator's duty and does then, in some ways, require the educator to intervene when comments are made. But there's also a way to do it that isn't just like, no, we don't say that, or shutting it down, or making people feel bad for what they said because they said it, because there's a difference between ignorant comments and intentional comments and open and closed discussions. So there are some things that we're not going to debate unless, if you come to me one-on-one and think that you have a good reason why it should be discussed, maybe an educator could discuss it that way, but there's certain things that have so much evidence that there really is no other argument. I think that can be dangerous. I'm not sure how I feel about that, but there are certain things like, are Black people valuable? There's certain things that we just can't get into because they're so widely, like, that's giving credence to beliefs that really shouldn't be given credence to. The thing I mentioned about discrimination versus inclusion, or specifically emotional immaturity of the cultural majority, would be like, when I talk about certain things, I will pre-warn people that some people are coming from different perspectives, and they'll say things and they don't always mean it as offensive as you take it, because it is offensive, but they either don't know that, or they don't know why, or they don't know to what extent. And so to react in such a way that is combative and angry and demeaning to them for saying those words out loud doesn't accomplish anybody's purpose, because it makes them defensive and it makes you, enraged, and suddenly we've created this back and forth, us and them. And so if we really want to actually help people understand to solve some of these problems and come to an understanding, that requires that we have an open mind, and it means that we can't immediately react in anger and frustration when someone says something that is offensive. Like I say, I think teachers can be political, but they shouldn't be partisan. I think if we're talking about specific issues, we can look at fact, evidence-based arguments. If we're getting partisan, that gets dangerous. And I think we need to create a safe space for honest dialogue and learning, which means voicing counterpoints and articulating the lived experience of opposing views. I do this all the time, where I'm bringing up some of the best counterpoints of opposing views that I actually disagree with. But I know that it's something that if I disagree with it, that it's an argument I have to have a good answer to, because it's a fairly, I understand why they say that, it's a compelling point. Or the lived experience, how people might feel, how one might feel in a certain situation or on another side, even if it's a side I don't disagree with, because that makes students feel seen and heard. That challenges students that might agree with me, whether I've explicitly said that or not, on whatever it is that I'm saying and think it's a non-issue. But the second I start voicing counterpoints that are decent arguments or the best ones that I can think of for that other side, they're now faced with dealing it. Maybe they haven't heard those arguments before. So the ones that, quote, agree with me have to have good reasons, and the ones that don't are a bit protected and seen, and they don't feel like I'm just in the other camp and don't see them and don't understand. It means anticipating students' feelings, meaning feeling excluded or reactionary responses. So I tell people, don't react immediately. And I just, sometimes it's just ignorance and sometimes it's hard to tell. So I'm not going to get it right every time, but let me decide. When you hear something like that, let me address it, at least initially. And if you feel there's something I'm not addressing, tell me. But that way I generally can tell if it's an honest question or if it is just meant to be spiteful. And let me deal with that as a teacher. Because then I can also have that conversation in private. And this is all assuming that you have the relationship with these students, that they feel safe enough to disagree with you, to talk about things that matter. You should model the fact that you're open to discussion, that they could change your mind if they had a better argument. And as far as to disclose or not to disclose, it's been shown that this has been done successfully both ways, disclosing or not disclosing certain viewpoints. I veer toward the latter. So some anecdotal evidence. There were students desperate to talk about the Ukraine-Russia conflict in class, and these students started just espousing out buzzwords like Sleepy Joe is so weak, Trump would have gone in there and totally solved the problem, and it was all character assassination at Biden for his handling of a very complex social, political, geopolitical conflict, and saying Trump would have done better. And it was a lazy argument, and it also just kind of ticked me off. And so I took a sec, took a breath, checked well, that was annoying at the door. And then I kind of engaged them because they were like right in front of my desk. And one was like, well, yeah, like he's like, well, why do you call him Sleepy Joe? And like, well, because he does. He like sleeps all the time instead of being present. I'm like, oh, okay. Like when? Like pushing them for evidence because I knew what they were saying. I didn't agree. I wanted them to have reasons why. I was like, well, there's a video. He fell asleep in this one meeting. I'm like, okay, can you show it to me? He's like, yeah, I can pull up my phone. I'm like, okay. We look at it. And he does seem to nod off. And it was like an 8 to 12 hour UN policy meeting that you can imagine is dull. And he had claimed, oh, yeah, someone had to come wake him up or he would have just fallen out of his chair. Well, actually, Secret Service agent walked up and then pulled a phone out of his pocket, but real slyly, showed him something, and then was talking in the ear to President Biden, and you could see he was nodding and his eyes had opened up and he was responding. And so the student hadn't seen the cell phone. The student thought they just walked over to wake him up. It wasn't. It was multiple things. And even if he did doze off, then I had the moment to say, how many times have you dozed off in first block? And that's 120 minutes. And you're not the President of the United States flying red eye. And he immediately recognized that the comment was hyperbole, that it exaggerated too far. But I said, it's okay. Like, I'm not mad. I'm just saying that I want you to have good reasons why you say what you say, and I'm okay with talking about these things in class. What I'm not okay with is just repeating sound bites that are either demeaning or attacking or drastically oversimplify a very complex issue that have real people involved. So if we want to talk about it, we can talk about it. But we're not going to just shout out, oh, Sleepy Joe. Like we're not going to just say things, because the problem is that the effect that has in the room is, again, polarizing. And if you really want to actually have good conversation and productive, respectful conversation, then you can't make a mockery of the other arguments, and you can't just attack people's character without having, there are lines. And they were super responsive. And then I told the class the last few minutes if they wanted to talk about it, they could come over to my desk. So they didn't have to be a part of it if they didn't want to, because they were doing independent work. And as long as they were done, if they wanted, they could come and talk about it. And we did. And I told them some of the things that I really thought, and that I would be disappointed if they didn't like if they disagreed with me, but they felt like they weren't allowed to disagree with me, that I always want them to be honest with me. And I tell them that repeatedly, almost every class period. Do I want you to be honest with me? Yes, profe. So if you disagree with this thing, do I want you to tell me? They're like, yes, profe. And so they're starting to trust that I actually mean what I say. And we had a great discussion. And it my reasoning for what I thought, then, I asked them, because some of their parents were military, asked for, so what have been their experiences? And they're like, yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I just wish there was a better answer. I'm like, I do too, guys. It's just, I think, but for me, this over here makes it a much more complicated issue. And I think that, at a certain point, we're not going to know which way, how things are going to go, but this is how I'm basing my opinion. And I had multiple students come up to me right after that class and like later that day saying that was amazing. They looked like I'd pulled off a magic trick because I took the really divisive and really in many ways hateful buzzword type comments and jokes and humor and I laid the boundary of like, hey, here's why we don't do that. But in a way that just challenged the students doing it to have good reasons for why they thought and understand why that wasn't okay. And then said, oh, we can talk about it, we just can't do this part. We're not going to do this part. And it wasn't in front of the whole class. But what was in front of the whole class that everyone could hear because they were dead silent if they weren't participating and they were looking, and some had their earbuds in, but some were definitely just listening to see how it went. And they're like, wow, like it was just respectful, and like you asked them things and they asked you, and it was just based on good ideas and admitting, I don't know, like part of me thinks this, part of me thinks this, and I like, why can't it always be like that? And I think part of it is if we avoid talking about things completely, it will never be like that because we have to practice at this. It says here, the interpersonal effect of mindless political humor and sound bites. I get on students all the time for this. What we argue in the book is that what's important is that teachers create a culture of fairness, and that means being fair and reasonable to all competing views that are in the classroom and represented in the public. The practice that we found most troubling is what we referred to as political seepage, meaning teachers who make sarcastic comments or use partisan humor. It's these offhanded comments that are sort of biting and mean-spirited about the political climate that I think is problematic, because it creates a climate not of fairness, but an insider-outsider feeling, meaning, do you get the humor I just said, or do you agree with me that the politician's a big idiot? And that invites some of the most divisive parts of partisan climate into the classroom. And that's exactly what I believe, and I think that applies to students too, that we need to call them to something higher than partisan sound bites and humor and jokes, because it does nothing. Students interviewed for the report said they don't report bullying. This is from Ed Week about increased discrimination and hate speech and treatment for Muslim students and students of color. They said they don't report bullying or harassment because the behavior is sometimes presented in a joking tone, or because they fear adults won't take it seriously. So students are either learning or we are teaching them that if it's a joke, or we just say later, oh, I didn't mean it, that it didn't count and didn't matter. And so then students that are hurt by it are like, well, I guess it doesn't count though, because it was a joke. And that reminds me of a quote from C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters of, anything, cruelty can be excused if only it's presented as humor, because then the greater sin is not having a sense of humor and being upset by it. And so you can get away with anything as long as you can play it off as a joke, and then you will be seen as the smart, clever one, not the person who just technically did something mean or said something mean. And it's the other person's job to not complain about it. So I think in this particular scenario, there's my many references. I think the problem is when we start to conflate standing up for certain principles and hostility, treat kind, respectful educational environments that value everybody in an equitable manner, going back to the responsibilities of educators, creating and nurturing intellectual, meaning good arguments, physical, because things can escalate to physical violence, emotional, social, civic potential of all students. They're not going to have civic potential if they can't talk to people who disagree with them. And emotionally and socially, they have to learn how to deal with these things, but in controlled ways. And so we need to express concern and empathy for students and encouragement for students that are being singled out, even if it is by the President of the United States. And we need to call a spade, we need to, not spade, but we need to call bigotry and racism. And just because the cultural majority has not experienced feeling left out, just like the Black Lives Matter movement, it's not saying that all lives don't matter. It's saying historically and culturally, Black lives have mattered less, and that's a problem, and we want to change that. And so that's not discrimination, being left out of that scenario. And the feeling discrimination is like, well, that's not fair. You're saying it for those people, but not me, which is the exact discrimination that people of color have been experiencing for decades. And so to equate white students' experience, or if they were uncomfortable or felt discriminated or targeted because they weren't included in that, to say, oh, we can't do Black Lives Matter because it's not fair to the white students, is like just victim blaming and pouring out more. It's just like a cycle of discrimination. And we're basing it all on the comfort of, generally speaking, cis white male students. And that's problematic. But if we go at it in ways that are combative or alienate those people from articulating a viewpoint and make them feel like their views and their person are like inextricably linked, we endanger isolating them. So we have to somehow do it in a way, and I think it depends on context. And so for me, I tend to get fairly good results talking with my highly religious or conservative white students because I'm just not as much of a threat. I represent many of those communities, and so I can have conversations with them that would be different if I were not who I am. Also relevant is that when I did Mexican Independence Day, I asked any students that had Mexican heritage or family or close friends that were of Mexican descent to talk with me, and I literally, before the class period, explained everything we were doing, why we were doing it, and how I decided what we would do and what we didn't do, and encouraged them if there was anything that made them feel uncomfortable or that they thought was inaccurate or that they had questions about or they didn't want to participate in, whether it was now or later or at any point, that I wanted them and their parents to let me know, because I was very aware that I, a very white, middle-aged, 30-something-year-old woman, is here talking to a room that has like 4 or 5 Hispanic or Mexican American students, telling them what their day is. And so I want to represent it the best way I can. And I do know quite a bit because I've been doing this for a while, but I want that open line of dialogue. And I had such good responses from that. So just being aware of that, like a lot of pre-preparation and knowing your students can go a long way. So I would say in this particular case, I think it's problematic that the, I guess, parent or person who's talking about discrimination in the sense of discriminating against the student whose family supports Trump, I think is problematic because it really, there are phrases in there that are very inflammatory and I think could be easily refuted by a policy that demands that students be able to learn in a non-hostile environment and like the student mentioned, he felt singled out because the poster didn't include white boys. I mean, that's a conversation to have with the student. Like, did they ask? The student ask? I mean, explaining, is it intentionally leaving them out because they don't matter? No. It's trying to encourage those who feel like they don't matter that they do. And there's a difference. And at a certain point, depending on what the viewpoint is, we can't force other students to agree with it or like that student. And so at a certain point, that freedom of expression without freedom from consequences, if they're constantly saying mean things or really bigoted mean things, and then other people don't want to hang out with them or talk to them, that's a natural consequence of saying those things. And that's what's going to happen in the real world. And so how are we preparing students if we say that all these things are the same? So that's where I would land on that issue.